Shaima Issa, a writer, poet and journalist, has completed her sentence and exits the gates of a Tunis prison on July 13, 2023. In the cool night, she is flocked by a roaring, teary-eyed crowd of relatives, friends and journalists chanting her name. She wears a red shirt adorning a single word, free. She shouts, "Who was also released?" echoing the sentiment of her fellow detainee. "We don't know why we went in or why we left. That's it."
Prior to her controversial arrest in February, Shaima was a candidate for the 2014 Tunisian legislative elections. She actively engaged parliamentarians on a number of issues, particularly related to women's rights. In 2020, she was appointed to the Ministry of Women and Family and continues to publish works of sociology today. The Tunisian French writer Helebeji encapsulates Shaima's reputation as a, quote, modern young woman full of spirit, so sensitive to violence against human rights, but insensitive to intimidation, whose democratic desire has the fearless seduction of her valor, convinced that the air of freedom and frankness that she spreads around her can win over the crowds. Tunisian President Kais Saied has taken a strong stance against those of Shaima's ilk, branding them as traitors and terrorists, and his decrees have led to the arrests of dozens of journalists and politicians. In turn, Shaima has defined herself not only by her commitment to Tunisian democracy and equality, but also by her selfless defiance to Saied's authoritarian repression. Helebeji, again, describes Shaima as, quote, not only a prisoner of conscience, praising her, quote, insolence, her resonance, which grows in the cowardly silence of men, her self-confidence, her bravery in the face of prohibition. These are the qualities that make Shaima Issa a powerful adversary to Saied's regime, within which she calls out the seeds of a dark regression in Tunisia's political history. She culminates her defiance as the spokesperson for the political collective, quote, Citizens Against the Coup d'etat, much to Saied's displeasure. Having spent time in Europe as an academic and being the daughter of an ex-political prisoner, Shaima represents additional symbols which mark her as a prime target in Saied's imagined counter-terrorism and counter-imperialism crusade. Although she is often portrayed by her opponents as being politically allied with the Islamist movement, Shaima has spent years working with Citizens Against the Coup d'etat to try to overcome social tensions and foster solidarity for progressive rights reforms between Islamist and secular political groups. Even by resolutely anti-Islamist politician Bashar Belhaj Hamida, Shaima was described as, quote, not sectarian and without prejudices. Her activism led to a military tribunal hearing in January 2023. After her release, she was called just 10 days later to appear again for the following charges: causing offense to the President of the Republic, inciting the army to disobey, and propagating rumors dangerous to public safety. Her lawyer claims she was being targeted specifically by the government for radio speech. Yet Shaima held steadfast, refusing to answer any and all questions. Released once more following the trial, her freedom had been limited by the courts, but a few weeks later, on February 22nd, Shaima and her sister were accosted while driving. Crossing a standard checkpoint, counter-terrorism police suddenly surrounded the car. Shaima had just enough time to call her lawyers before she was forced into a police van. There were cops everywhere, she says. They blocked our path from all sides. I quickly understood this was not a simple identity check. The very same day, the police arrested the head of the centrist Liberal Party, Issam Chebbi, after searching his home without a warrant. I can no longer accept this situation, because this situation is such that I am not even considered a citizen, as my fundamental human rights are being denied to me, and now I am deprived of these rights.
As you may have suspected, these arrests were not isolated incidents. Under the orders of President Kais Saied, waves of arrests of radio station directors, journalists, lawyers, and political leaders were underway. They were enacted with little to no criminal evidence, the only explanations provided being Saied's accusations of conspiracy against internal and external state security. As Human Rights Watch writes, Saied does so with a blatant disregard for the independence of the judiciary and the presumption of innocence. Many countries, from the United States to Egypt, allow the practice of holding people before convictions for lengthy periods of time as punishment prior to judgment. The state of the world regarding prisons and fair trials, unfortunately, remains abysmal. Under counter-terrorism law, Chima could legally be held for 14 months without trial, and held 15 days before a charge even needs to be brought up. She was also denied access to a lawyer for 48 hours after detention. Journalist Zainab Ben Ismail and her team at Intifada compiled a series of questions that were asked of Chima by the police during her investigation. These ranged from her contacts with American embassy staff to her reason for voting for Kais Saied in 2019. According to Intifada, Chima had denounced the constitutional and political impasse in which the country had found itself since the coup on July 25, 2021. She also expressed her doubts that the defense institutions of the country would continue to support such a process. Her cell phone and notebooks had been confiscated and were being analysed. A decision is made by the judge within 36 hours of the hearing. Chima is charged with conspiring against state security, the punishment of which is normally decades of imprisonment or death. She is then placed under indefinite pre-trial detention. Chima recalls prison as another world during an interview with Monya Ben Hamadi. I wasn't scared, but I cried twice. The first time when they took away my glasses. That's when I understood I had lost control over my own life. The second time was when I was forced to undress and asked to bend over and cough. Prison taught Chima many things, perhaps most of all the pointlessness of the carceral system and the psychophysical injustices suffered by prisoners. 5 long months pass until she is finally released on July 13th, 2023, wearing a bright red shirt with the word "free" adorned. Chima is welcomed back by a roaring crowd of family, friends, and supporters. Quote, "I can't deny my happiness of being free, but it's an incomplete happiness, because the injustice I suffered is still being suffered by my friends who are in prison, so I can't be happy while they are still in prison." Former Minister Lazar Akremi, who was detained and incarcerated in the same period as Chima, was also freed that night. Quote, "We don't know why we went in, nor why we've come out. That's it, quite simply."
Although she's been released, Chima's freedom rests on uncertain grounds. According to Amnesty International, she's still being investigated by a military court for criticizing authorities, a charge which threatens to put her behind bars for 10 years. She's also being investigated for the charge of taking part in an alleged conspiracy against the state, an act for which the price is decades in prison or even execution. Although the Tunisian government has not committed a public execution for over 30 years, President Saied has voiced his support for reinstating the death penalty. Chima is stuck, immobile, unable to flee the country, as she has been banned from traveling abroad and appearing in public spaces, facing jail for life or even death. As we write these words, 6 months after her release, Chima Issa has just appeared before the Tunis military court. The court found her guilty of insulting the president and spreading false news, sentencing her to a suspended 1-year prison sentence. Fida Hamami, Amnesty's Tunisia research and advocacy advisor, commented, quote, "Chima Issa is a well-known writer and opposition figure who should have not been charged in the first place, as she was simply peacefully exercising her right to freedom of expression. Tunisia's authorities must quash this outrageous conviction from a military court immediately. Her case was brought by an increasingly repressive government that will stop at nothing to silence voices of dissent." Welcome to Voices of Dissent, a history of freedom of speech in Tunisia. This audiovisual series is centered around the continuous struggle for freedom of speech and expression throughout Tunisia's modern history, from the birth of the French protectorate to the present-day regime of President Kais Saied. We'll be highlighting the voices and amazing work done by defined Tunisian journalists, scholars, and writers, so please do check out our bibliography in the description and our suggestions for people to follow and works to learn from.
We begin our story in the 1800s. Following centuries of rule over the Tunisian people at the behest of the Ottoman Empire, the dynasty of beys, or governors, sought to increase their already considerable autonomy by asking the French for help following a severe financial crisis. By lending massive amounts of money to the beys, the French gradually solidified Tunisia's financial reliance on European gold. Slowly but surely, the French gained a political control over the land by persuading them to cut off their relations with the Ottomans. In 1881, the financial situation had worsened as successive rulers bankrupted the treasury. Exploiting a narrative that northern tribes had stormed Algeria, France invaded Tunisia, seizing control and crushing insurgencies from Tunisian freedom fighters through a bloody and devastating war. French Prime Minister Jules Ferry laid out openly and honestly the French state's supremacist ideology in his 1884 Assembly speech. Quote, "Gentlemen, we must speak more loudly and more honestly. We must say openly that indeed the higher races have a right over the lower races. In our time, I maintain that the European nations acquit themselves with generosity, with grandeur, and with sincerity upon this superior civilizing duty." Thus began the colonial racist dictatorship of the French protectorate of Tunis, forced upon the Tunisian people, their will and dignity ignored by the corrupted beys. Over the years, France would plunder resources, land, and men from the land, even going as far as to send 10,000 Tunisian men to their deaths for its wartime conquests. In response to the development of journalism and popular communication at the turn of the 19th century, the French protectorate implemented media supervision and monopolistic measures. Journalist Rim Benarous writes, "Journalists and newspaper owners were harassed, tracked down, and intimidated by the French colonial forces because of their writings and political views. Many newspapers were launched during the protectorate, both in Arabic and in French, often facing severe constraints over the years, even outright bans. French colonial authorities maintained control over everything, from the content covered to the editorial line." In defiance of these suppressive pressures, Kamel Gendoubi writes of the sheer importance of the Tunisian press. Quote, "Their most beautiful weapons of war were the oratory arts, the French and Arabic press, prosaic writings and poetry. They created associations and meeting places. They demanded the emancipation of Tunisian women, the right to education, to their Tunisian identity, and to a constitution." Writers and revolutionaries emerged, such as Abu Qasim Chebi, Muhammad Ali al-Hami, and Taha Haddad. Alongside their new burgeoning national identity, a new generation of Tunisians, exasperated with the existence and policies of the protectorate, worked to shake off their colonial overlords. According to Tunisian scholar Professor Khamis Afawi, French censorship prohibited incitement of hatred or violence, and defamation of the president, the army, the court, the bey and his family, and even France as an entity. The protectorate also exerted control over the Tunisian people through cruel and arbitrary punishment. And as Dr. Fatma Al-Zubari writes, the French took advantage of the bey's compliance, easily imposing military councils and courts and authorizing the colonizers to use any means necessary to squash dissent and punish revolts. The word rebel became an easy go-to for the French, who could, without trial, exile dissidents or sentence them to death or hard labor. Al-Zubari notes that the Napoleonic Code was especially vengeful in nature, created to serve the empire, and so despite being a so-called code of law, its violence was nowhere else as explicit as in the French colonies.
Tunisians, of course, did not abide by these tyrannical rules. In 1911, the French troops shot and killed peaceful protesters in Djellaz, some of whom then responded by throwing rocks and defending themselves. This prompted a vicious response from the French, who sought to finally crush this display by dragging out 56 people in front of tribunals for imprisonment and execution. Either through a sense of defensiveness or opportunity, the protectorate reacted to the Djellaz conflict by declaring a state of siege. This enlarged their authoritarian powers, allowing them to ban newspapers and push authoritarian policies within the confines of French law. Although the state of siege ended 10 years later, the protectorate continued its strategy of arbitrarily conflating wartime security with the protection of the regime. From 1939, newspapers were still banned for provoking discord, in effect outlawing the publication of atrocities committed by the French army, criticism of the French governor in Tunisia or the Bey, but also nationalist political ideology, news regarding public strikes and struggles, and even the word constitution. As Tunisians read newspapers, they would be met with entire paragraphs blacked out with the word censored. To top it all off, newspapers had to apply for a license to publish their work, which, of course, was granted only to those whose cooperation with the empire was not in question. However, the protectorate's control over the minds of the Tunisian people was not absolute. Their policies often pushed people towards underground sources to circumvent censorship, leading a thriving subaltern news network like the communist newspaper Al-Taliya on the margins of society and hidden from French eyes. These channels of free thought and spaces for the vocalization of the outrage against the protectorate's oppression were the lifeblood of ever-growing revolutionary sentiment against the French protectorate. For decades, Tunisian political leaders sought a solution to their colonial problem. Tensions erupted between factions as some believed the French were to be reasoned with, while others saw no reason to negotiate with their captors. And after many unsuccessful uprisings and campaigns for independence, Tunisia managed to break free from its colonial shackles, propelling nationalist hero Habib Bourguiba to the forefront of Tunisian history.